Good morning and welcome to our webinar today on managing winter wheat crops this spring. My name is Jane Kitchen and I'm in the marketing team at BASF. Before I introduce you to our speakers for today, just wanted to give a short little introduction to the webinar itself. As we all know, 2024 is proving to be an extremely challenging season with highly variable crops out there between and across fields. I think obviously where possible, it's best to assess those fields on a field-by-field basis and time fungicides where possible, where 2/3 of the target leaves are fully emerged. Today's webinar will largely focus on recent NIAB trials work on variable leaf layer emergence, including implications and advice for this spring, and then on reducing Septoria risk both this coming season and in also future seasons. So without further ado, I'm delighted to be welcomed today by our guest speakers. So Dr Aoife O'Driscoll from NIAB, Head of Business and Technical Development, Steve Dennis, and our Business Development Manager, Jared Bonner. So welcome, guys. Give us a wave.
Hi, nice to see you.
Good. So I think probably don't need any more further introduction for our first speaker today, Aoife. So I'm going to hand the floor to you. Thank you, Aoife.
Great. Thanks, Jane. So hi, my name's Aoife O'Driscoll. I'm a plant pathologist at NIAB. I'm going to talk you through some work we've been doing on leaf layer emergence with funding from BASF over the last 2 years. And we've had some really interesting results, and hopefully that will feed into some of the on-farm decision-making for the coming season. So the background to this really is, I think, as you go into the 2024 spray campaign, we really have to think about weather patterns. And today's weather pattern is that there is no pattern anymore. So disease levels and growth stages, as we're looking at them now, are very variable, and they're massively dependent on sowing dates, the variety you've chosen, and also site conditions up and down the country. When we think about leaf layer emergence, this dictates the time that leaves are actually exposed to infection, and together with disease risk, this will also determine spray timings. And a key factor in T1 decision processes for this year is when leaf 3 will emerge, and that will be very variable depending on a number of factors that will come throughout this hour, I'm sure. So when we think about when T1s are actually supposed to be applied, the classic timing is when 2/3 of leaf 3 has emerged on the main shoot. The biggest drivers in how uniformly those leaves emerge across a field or a farm or across the country are the variety choice and also the thermal time, or more scientifically we call it the phyllochron. And in many cases, later sowing will decrease both the phyllochron and the total leaves that are emerged. Also, cooler conditions will lead to more varied emergence of the same leaf layer within the crop. So taking together all these factors and knowing the conditions that we've had going into this season and also the last couple of seasons where weather patterns have been very variable across seasons, we decided to look at some trials work looking at leaf layer emergence. So to do this, we had 4 sites in 2022 and 2023. And they were mainly variety time fungicide trials, so just very standard trials with a number of varieties in there and a number of fungicide treatments. But the point of difference in these trials was that we monitored leaf layer emergence as well in those trials. So at the 4 sites we had a trial up at AB in Lincolnshire, we had one down in Dorset, one in Cambridge, and one in Sutton Scotney. And we went out every week from growth stage 32 on and monitored leaf layer emergence. So we basically went out and tagged lots of plants. So you can see here the yellow and blue tags that we put on different plants in the field from growth stage 32 onwards. And in 2022, we tagged 36 plants per variety in that field. And in 2023, we had a smaller number of varieties and we tagged 120 plants per variety. And in all of those tag plants, we monitored how many of those leaves were emerged or how much percentage of that leaf was emerged. And then once full flag leaf had emerged in those varieties, we monitored percentage disease, so how fast disease was progressing in relation to leaf layer emergence. But just because of time today, and what we really want to focus on is the variation in leaf flare emergence across those varieties and across time. So we're going to look at two sites today. The first of these is the Duxford site at Cambridge in 2022, and I've just put in the weather patterns for the site. So looking at temperature and rainfall, because it's quite different for the two sites we're going to look at today. So you can see there, we had a very, very dry spring, so there was no rainfall in April, and then when rain did come in May, it chucked it down. So this made a lot of things very difficult. It made the gap between T1 and T2 quite long, and it also caused a protracted time in terms of the varieties that we looked at, how long those leaf flares took to emerge. So at that site, we looked at 8 different varieties, and you can see on the bottom there the varieties that we looked at. So Gravity, Siskin, Graham, Zayat, Saki, Theodore, and Barrel and X-Days. And on the x-axis, we've got the time that we first started looking at leaf 3 emergence, so from the 12th of April all the way up to 17th of May, and looking at how many of those leaves emerged across that time. So there's 2 things to look at in this graph. The first of all is to look at a specific date in time. So let's say, for example, we took the 22nd of April. So say you were going out to do your T1s at this time point. And what you see across the 8 varieties is at that time, out of the 36 leaves that we examined at that time point, how many of them were emerged. And so you see for varieties like Saki, for example, at 22nd of April, we had around 18 of those leaf 3s emerged. But then as you go up, you can see the variation there in the number of flag leaves that were, or number of leaf 3s that were fully emerged on that date. The other thing to look at as well is if we were to maybe consider this from a different angle is, well, okay, at which time point will 3/4 of those leaves be emerged? So you'll say, for example, 75% of 36 leaves is 27. So the dotted line indicates there at what time point we had, or date, we had those 27 leaves emerged. And you can see there that 6 of those varieties had hit that date roughly at the beginning of April, but then 2 varieties did not make that time. So you've 2 ways of looking at it really is a state specific and the range of leaf flare emergence at that time, but also looking at if you're managing 8 varieties, and that's not realistic for most farms, but you could be managing 4 varieties, what that variation would be. So by the time we started looking at leaf 2s at this site again, so let's say, for example, we take a specific date and we look again, say at the 30th of April, maybe is another example, or perhaps the 2nd of May. And you can see again, even though things start to catch up, and by flag leaves things do start to catch up, but as the season goes on and the weather gets warmer, you do find that varieties do start to catch up. But even in this situation here again, you know, big variation at a specific time point. So you can look at, say, the 2nd of May or the 30th of April, and you can see there the variation that exists. And also, if we take that time point again of when 27 leaves were emerged out of the 36, the varieties take a long time to get to that. And there's a big variation there in terms of what dates those varieties will hit that 27 leaves emerged. So for example, Zayat gets there around the 24th of April. But again, something like Saki takes until the 6th of May. So you've kind of got about a 10-day gap there in between when certain varieties will hit that 27 leaves emerged, yeah, about a 10-day gap in between those varieties. So that was really interesting. We probably weren't expecting such a long gap for those varieties. And then we saw the same thing again for flag leaves. So as I said before, you know, flag leaves, by that time they do tend to catch up, and we did see that in this trial. So by kind of 17th of May, everything was there in terms of leaf flare emergence. But again, just looking at specific time points for when those flag leaves hit that key date of 27 flag leaves, you can see that some varieties were on the 11th of May and some varieties did not get there until the 15th of May. And also that big variation there in terms of the number of flag leaves emerged at specific time points. So that was really interesting, and probably considering the season that we had in 2022, where we had that very kind of cold April and dry weather, and then things started to pick up in May. Perhaps you might expect that because crops might be behind, and the phyllochron is quite different. But 2023, we thought it might be different, and that was largely because of the weather patterns that we saw. So I've just picked one site here, so Sutton, Scotney, down in Hampshire, and you can see there the rain levels that we had and the temperatures that we had. So the temperatures were slightly above average going into May, and the rainfall patterns were kind of as you'd expect for that season. So very, very different site conditions, and you would expect that perhaps things might not be as variable in terms of leaf flare emergence, and that wasn't the case actually for last season. So in this trial, what we did was we had 4 varieties. So we trimmed it down and we looked at this in more detail. So we had Saki, Gleam, Graham, and Theodore at this site. And we looked at not just full leaf flare emergence, but we also measured the spread in leaf flare emergence across those varieties. So here again, we're looking at flag leaf emergence. And if we go again with our specific time points, so let's say, for example, you go out to spray your T2 on the 19th of May, and how many of those flag leaves will be fully emerged out of the 120 that we monitored? So we upped the number of flag leaves, decreased the number of varieties. And you can see there that the 19th of May, you had anywhere between about kind of 2 to 3 flag leaves for Saki. But for other varieties, then you're talking kind of 70 to 110. So about 70 to 80% emergence versus 5% emergence at that specific time point. And again, taking that arbitrary number. So if you went at a specific date, so say you want to go out when 70% of those, 75% of those flag leaves are emerged, how many of those varieties are emerged at specific time points? And you can see there that one variety gets there on the 17th of May, but the Saki doesn't even get there by the 25th of May. So again, a big 10-day gap there, and when all those flag leaves hit and at what time in the season those varieties get there. So this would be a very classic example of what you'd have in the field or on a typical farm. So 4 varieties, perhaps drilled in roughly the same drilling period. So across maybe we tried to get all the wheat in within a 10-day period. These would have been all drilled on the same day, so sometime in October. And yeah, you can see just huge variation, a 10-day gap there, and when those varieties reach that critical time point of 75% flag leaf emergence. We also looked then at the spread of emergence. So we measured the flag or the leaf twos and the flag leaves every week to see how much of those flag leaves and leaf twos were actually out. So we measured them in an increment of 0, 25, 50, and 75%. So how many of those flag leaves were at 50% emergence? How many of those leaf twos were at 75% emergence? And we did that weekly for a 4-week period. So I've just focused here on the 4th of May for leaf twos. And again, on the bottom axis, you've got the 4 varieties that we looked at. And on the y-axis, you've got the percentage of leaf flare emergence. And the main take home from here really is just to look at the variation across those 4 varieties. So when you look at Theodore, for example, you can see that on the 4th of May, the leaf twos for Theodore were anywhere between 50 and 100%, whereas Saki at that time point was anywhere between 25 and 100%. And the average across those 120 leaves is in those blue boxes there. So if you've gone out on the 4th of May to examine those crops, then Saki would have been on average at 50% leaf two emergence, whereas Theodore would have been at 90% at that specific time point. Does it start to even out the further you go in the season? So let's look at the 11th of May, and you can see there those 3 varieties, Gleam, Graham, and Theodore, had all hit 90%, but the Saki was still lagging behind, so around 8 or 9%. So we still had some leaf twos at this time where the Sakis were at 50% leaf flare emergence. So again, very, very interesting to look at that. Then we move on to flag leaves. So again, looking at specific time points, so 15th of May, and we saw the same trend again. So yeah, so the Theodore again on the 15th of May, looking at the flag leaves, you can see that all those flag leaves were at 50 to 100%, whereas the Saki had quite a significant proportion of them that were down there at that 25% emergence. And again, in the blue boxes, you can see if we averaged out across those 120 leaves, the average percent of where those flag leaves were at. So again, the Saki and the Gleam lagging quite far behind, 36 and around the 55% mark for Saki and Gleam, whereas the Graham and Theodore speeding ahead in terms of their average leaf layer emergence. And then finally, yeah, so if we went out again 4 days later, Saki's still lagging behind. So a lot of flag leaves still sitting there, about 25% of those flag leaves still sitting there, only 25% emerged, whereas the Theodore and the Graham still really catching up. So again, you're thinking about when you're going out to spray, imagine you're going out to do your T2s and you're trying to catch that specific time point when overall flag leaf emergence is about 75% across the field. And you've got those 4 varieties in there. What are the implications there in terms of spray timing, and how much of that leaf layer emergence are you either catching too late or you're missing completely according to individual varieties? And I think this provides a nice visual estimate of what's actually happening on farm across the season and across 2 very different seasons. And yeah, so finally, 25th of May. So at this time point, if you got on to do your T2 sprays, you know, you'd be probably a little bit late for Theodore in particular, maybe perhaps Graham. Gleam had just reached it at this time point, so Gleam would have just hit the 100%, but the Saki's still lagging behind there. So you would have had 50% of those leaves still sitting at 50% emergence. Okay, so yeah, so completions and thought for 2024 season. So we've done these trials now for 2 years, looking at leaf layer emergence across seasons, across locations, and across varieties. And I think what we've really seen is that it's not just the leaf 3 that can be quite variable, but also leaf 2 and flag leaf emergence. And this can occur for many varieties, even within the same field. So these would have just been variety trials and replicated plots. And even where we had 120 leaves, or whether it was 36 leaves, we still saw massive variation, anywhere between 25% and 100% leaf layer emergence at specific time points for specific varieties. And also the other thing we saw was if you went out and you were looking for how many of those varieties were hitting the kind of classic 75% or 70% emergence, the gap can be for up to 10 days for certain varieties across the season. Going into 2024, you know, we have that later drilling across a lot of farms and cooler conditions, which we have now, and it could be the same for going into March. And we predict that leaf 3 emergence could be up to a week apart at T1. So when you're going out and you've got 4 or 5 varieties to manage across your farm, that leaf 3 emergence for either individual varieties or looking at cross varieties could be up to a week apart. The other thing to say is that many crops are sitting shorter than usual, and that's due to many different factors. First of all, it's the sowing date, but also the deluge of rain that we've had. So the height, so classically when we're looking at leaf 3 emergence and we're doing our dissections, some people might not bother to do dissections in certain situations, and they'll just look to capture the height between the internodes. In the season that we have, the height might not be a good indicator of that actual leaf layer emerging. So it's really important that when you're going out, you do dissections, and you'll have to go out and do proper leaf layer inspections to get accurate timings.
Great, thanks, Aoife. I think we can all agree there's some very interesting work there. And actually what we sort of see is getting that timing is critical, but in a normal year, it's difficult. Probably this year, coming up the 2024 season, it's going to be extremely difficult. So what I want to show and talk about today is a little bit about Septoria epidemic, how it comes into the crop, and then look at the way potentially we can maybe delay that epidemic moving through the crop onto it. So first of all, what I want to show and look at is Septoria epidemic and how it moves into the crop. And what I'm showing you here is we've got the last 4 years worth of trials data from the BASF trials database. And what we've done is we've pulled these trials apart and look at when Septoria comes in. So what I'm showing you here is leaf 3, leaf 2, and leaf 1. And the lines are showing the individual years. And this is the visual Septoria infection on the untreated plots. So as we can sort of see last year, no big sort of revelation to anybody. Last year we saw in 2023 Septoria come in really early into the wheat crops. And what we sort of say is high epidemic on leaf 3, really high proportion of it. We can sort of see on the left hand side there on leaf 3 that basically we've got a really high level and a lot higher than the last 3 years, so 2021 and 22. You know, really high pressure, really earlier on, coming in really strong. But as we see as the season moves on, that pressure is not pushed up to the next leaf layers. We don't see that high Septoria pressure moving to leaf 2 in the middle or to leaf 1. And as we see as the season goes on, that pressure is slowed down, is delayed, and we're not getting it moving up the leaf layers. And why is that? Last year, obviously, we know really wet beginning of the year, but as the season went on, it dried up. And those dry conditions later on the season reduced that Septoria pressure and reduced it moving up to the higher leaf layers. So therefore, reducing that epidemic. So, you know, as we can see, the Septoria epidemic was quickly last year in the lower canopy over a more normal year, but those dry conditions removed that transmission up to the top of the plant. And this was caused by this dry May. But what can fungicides do to this? Can fungicides help, or can fungicides mirror this effect? So what I want to show you here is some glasshouse work that we did with ADAS. So this was ADAS Rosemond in 2022. And actually what we did is a really protective situation within a glasshouse. And we want to sort of see how fungicides work and whether they can delay the symptoms of Septoria moving forward. So what we did is we sprayed a target leaf with a fungicide in a very obviously protected controlled conditions in a glasshouse, and then the following day we introduced Septoria on the leaf. And what we're looking at here is Univoc and Revastar, and what we're looking at here is the delay in visual symptoms of the pycnidia on the untreated leaves. So the untreated took about 3 weeks before we saw visible symptoms. The Univoc gave us an additional 10 days before we saw those visual symptoms. And actually, when we look at Revastar, what we got was an additional 6 days on top of that. So 16 days after we saw it on the untreated. So the Revastar compared to the Univoc is giving us an additional 6 days of a disease-free leaf. So what can that do? You know, if you're not seeing it on that leaf, it's going to take time for it to develop on that leaf. And then what we're going to do is obviously there's a knock-on effect to that moving to the next leaf. So, you know, as ADAS sort of concluded in their studies, is we are delaying the rate of infection. So the Septoria can reinfect the next canopy moving forward. So therefore that reduces the level of Septoria infection and epidemic moving through the crop. So, in a glasshouse of very controlled conditions, 2022. So in 23, we decided to move this out to the field and have a look and see whether we saw a similar effect within the field. So we've got a field trials here, as I sort of said by ADAS. It's going to take a little bit of time to talk me through this, so please bear with me, but I think it's very important because we have a lot of data here to show you. So what we're doing is a field experiment at the bottom, within winter wheat at the bottom. We've got spray timings, and it's important to point out this is not a spray program. This is one trial with 5 different spray timings, a T1, and that's all it got, an early T2, a standard T2 timing, a later T2 timing, and then a one later on in the timing, the growing season, growth stage 59. And actually what the trialists at ADAS did for us is actually when they went out and they sprayed these timings, they measured what leaves were out and what proportion of leaves were out. So as we can sort of see in that early T1 timing, we've got 58% of leaf 3 out, we've got leaf 2 just poking out, and we've got no flag leaf visible at all, which you would expect. As we move into the early T2 timings, what we're seeing is we've got all of leaf 3, most of leaf 2, and some of leaf 1. And obviously as we move along to the later timings, we've got more and more of leaf 1, the flag leaf out, And the later timings, obviously, we've got 100% of all 3 leaves out. So again, we know exactly when the applications were made, what proportion of what leaf was emerged. So what were we targeting? What were we hitting? And what they also did for us at the same time is they assessed Septoria levels as well. So hopefully you can sort of see, you know, at the early T1 timings, you know, we had no Septoria or very little on leaf 1, 1%, leaf 3, 58%, and then as we move up the timings, we're obviously seeing more leaf come out, but more of that leaf being infected until we get to the very end of growth stage 59, where we're seeing Septoria on all 3 leaves. So, you know, we're moving from a very protectant situation into a very curative situation. So moving on is what the next thing they did is they measured the healthy area duration. So this is a proportion of the green leaf tissue and the time it's there. So it's a sum of green tissue and time throughout the season. And obviously, as we can sort of see, as we move through these timings, Revasol, as we move to the later, you know, the more targeted T2 timings, we are building green leaf tissue. And I think this hopefully will be no big surprise to anybody. You know, T2 is the best timing if we're putting a single application on, gives us the most green leaf retention. And as we can sort of see, you know, we build up green leaf as we get to that classic T2 timing. But obviously, as we go later on the season, there's more Septoria already established in the leaves, so that green leaf area duration reduces. So we have Septoria there, sorry, we have Revasol there. And then if we bring up the inner trek, what we can sort of see there is, you know, we're having a reduction in those earlier timings. So, you know, it would suggest there, as we've seen in the lab studies, that we're getting this sort of extra 7 days a week of protection, and that's stopping the reinfection of the leaves, stopping the Septoria epidemic growing. And as we move up to the timings in that protective situation, as we would imagine, we're reducing it, so therefore we're getting that benefit. As we get later on in the season, things maybe start and even up a little bit more. But I think for us, you know, we're talking about difficult timings. It might be interesting for us to actually take a look at the T2 and have a bit more of a deeper dive into those 3 T2 timings. So it's the same trial, the same experiment, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up those 3 middle timings. So the earlier T2, the more classic on time, and the later T2 one. And actually what we can sort of see here is the fungicide property change over the course of 2 weeks. And as I touched on earlier, you know, we think about protection, we think about curativity, and actually what we need in a fungicide is both, because, you know, we're never really in a protectant situation, we're never really in a curative situation. What we have is both of them at the same time. But what we can also sort of see is the earlier T2 timings. If we go on a bit earlier and we think back to Aoife's work, very difficult to judge, you know, when are 2/3 of the flag leaves out. In a lot of cases, you're going to have some flag leaves that are there of being left exposed, or some flag leaves that are not fully protected. So as well as the protection and the curative, actually to get this delay in reinfection, so this slowing down of the Septoria epidemic, the slowing down of moving up the leaves and up the canopy towards the top of the crop is very important. And what we can sort of clearly see here is, you know, we're getting this delay in reinfection from the Revasol over the inner trek, giving us, like we sort of say, about an extra week of protection. What about yield? So we've moved on to here. So, you know, very much the same slide, but last time we were looking at healthy area duration. What we've got here is the yield, and actually what we see is very comparable yields here. Why do we think that was last year? If we think, you know, that the weather played into the hands, it dried up, and actually we stopped that the high levels of Septoria moving up the plant. If we think back to the first slide in 2003, the really high epidemic starting at the beginning of the season, and then obviously we moved through the season, it slowed down. So here we are with yields, very comparable yields between the two products. So I think that's from me today, but hopefully, you know, some things interesting to think about. If we think about Aoife's work, you know, really difficult, if not impossible this year, to get the correct timings and to get them spot on. So what are we going to be in? We're going to be in a very curative, a very protecting situation. So we're going to need a robust fungicide program that can basically challenge all of them, can look after your protective, but also has some curative. And obviously, if there's a product out there like Revasol is shown to be, that actually delay the speed that the Septoria can reinfect, delay that epidemic through the crop, it'll be a very important tool for growers this season. So that's it from me. I will hand over to my colleague Steve Dennis, who's going to touch on some resilient disease control points. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Aoife. Thank you, Jane. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. Really appreciate you giving up some time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And just really drawing this to a close, it's worth thinking about the journey we've been on this morning. We started with Jane talking about how crops were particularly variable in 2024. And I don't need to tell you about that after the autumn and the winter we've come through. And many people I'm talking about too are also talking about how they, in many cases, have got multiple crops in one field this year, which is just going to make management of fungicides and other inputs particularly challenging. And if that wasn't difficult enough, what Aoife then showed us in trials that were done in very, very even crops, where we were looking at very consistent growth, even in those situations, in an even year, we were seeing really big variation in leaf emergence over different varieties, but also within a variety as well. And where did we end up there? Well, we ended up really, particularly when you're thinking about your T1 timing, that accurate dissection is an absolute must this year. Even if you don't do that in another year, this is a year where you really must do that. And one of the reasons why we need to think about that, whether at T1, but also thinking about the best we can accurately time T2 fungicides, is that we should always remember that any part of the leaf that is not exposed to fungicide remains untreated. There is no movement of fungicide from the treated part of the leaf to the untreated part of the leaf. And that's one of the reasons why accurate timings really, really matter. And then we moved on to Jared, and Jared showed us some really interesting data that ADAS produced in 2023. What they were looking at actually was the speed of the epidemic, really. And what we saw was that although 2023 had a very, very dry May, and as Jared showed you, the disease development, which was very rapid at T1 last year, did not rapidly move to the top parts of the leaf. But even in that situation, our ADAS were actually able to show that Revastar and Revasol were able to further slow the epidemic. There was an extra 6 days in a lab study over Univog where Revastar delayed the emergence of visual septoria on the leaf. And of course, if you emerge the appearance of visual septoria, you're actually going to delay the time when the spores are released and actually will reinfect further up the plant. So the question is, will we get that dry May again this year? Well, you're not going to get the answer to that on this webinar, I'm afraid. None of us know. But what we do know is that by using Revasol, by using Revastar, we can actually do something to mitigate the movement and the speed of the movement of spores up the plant and actually change the course of the epidemic. So that's where we've been so far. And I'd really like us now to move on to just one last thought about how we put together a fungicide program and talk a little bit about resilient disease control. And of course, there are two critical features that we really need to think about when we put together a fungicide program, and the first one is crucially important. And both of these are really important for sustainable use of fungicides. The first one is, well, we just need to control the disease, don't we? That's why we buy fungicides. We need to maintain that healthy canopy, and we need to build high quality yields. But actually, we also need to make sure that we maintain the efficacy of the fungicide armory that we have for as long as we have. There's a lot of different active ingredients out there available to us, but actually there are very few different modes of action that give us effective disease control. And I want to talk a little bit about that just in the next 5 minutes or so as we draw this to a close, and think about how we can use different modes of action to put together a very robust and resilient program that actually gives us the best chance of maintaining the efficacy of these different modes of action as long as we can. And I think for one generalization really to get into our minds as we think about these is actually for a fungicide to break, it is higher risk the more efficacy it gives you. Now that's a generalization and there are exceptions to that. But generally, the more efficacious an active ingredient is, the more selection pressure it exerts on itself. And that's one reason why we need to balance things. And ideally, we would use products in balanced mixtures to actually protect the other mode of actions that are in the tank. So let's just have a think about the key active ingredients that are available to us in the market at the moment. And there's 5 key groups of fungicides that we are using. We're using the triazoles, multi-sites, QOIs, often called strobilurins, SDHIs will be familiar to you, and also QIIs in Inatrec. And there's a few points to bring out on this slide. And firstly, think about how resistance develops and the pattern of resistance develops to each of these groups. Because within the grouping there, actually fungicides are cross-resistant to each other. So if you lose performance to one active ingredient in a group, it will affect the performance of very close correlation there. And if we think about the triazoles first on the top of your screen, triazoles have market. So very few conventionally grown winter wheat crops in the past nearly 50 years have been grown without the use of any triazole chemistry at all. And yet they're still working well. There is some insensitivity that's developed to triazoles, no question over that period. But the thing about triazole insensitivity, it's a very gradual process. We see very small movements in the sensitivity when they move. We don't see a big catastrophic drop-off in performance. And I think the group that's at the other end of the spectrum for that are the QOIs, the strobilurins. And actually, when they were first launched, products like F500 were giving exceptionally high control of Septoria, yet a single mutation and actually the performance against Septoria dropped off very, very quickly. SDHIs seem to be somewhere in the middle. We did wonder in the early days of SDHIs whether they would break very, very rapidly when they did go. But actually, there's a very complex situation out there. Lots of mutations, some mutations giving you a bigger impact on efficacy than others, but a very diverse pattern across the UK and Europe. And actually, we're still, on the whole, getting useful control from SDHIs, although admittedly not to the level that we were getting when they were first launched. And then the QIIs. Now, the QIIs, there is no detected insensitivity out there. No one has yet found any isolates of Septoria for insensitivity to that. but there have been some lab studies that have discovered that it can happen. So nature tends to win. So at some point there is likely to be some insensitivity come, and there's every chance that that will move certainly much more rapidly than the triazoles if it does come. But the good news is today there isn't any insensitivity out there. So that's an active ingredient we should be using and should be building into our programs. But you will have noticed there's different colors on the screen, and the different colors reflect the risk of that active ingredient, in our view, in developing resistance to itself. And the greener the active ingredient on the screen, the more robust it is likely to be in terms of resistance development. And that could be in terms of the speed of development, because I said triazoles are actually proven to be very slow in their movement, or it could be like a multi-site where we just don't believe that will ever happen. I guess one possible controversial point there is the strobilurins, which are green. Now, of course, they're green because the damage is already done. The horse is already bolted. QOIs are not going to move further for Septoria because actually they've already moved. SDHIs, well, it depends on the level of performance. There has been some shift already. Xemium's been used, 10, 12 years now in the market, still giving us good activity, but not to the level it once did. As SDHIs perhaps increase in their performance, then it is likely there will be further movement and selection for insensitivity with that mode of action. So that's the point. The colour gives us an indication of where we believe the risks really sit in terms of that mode of action developing insensitivity. But the length of the line actually gives us an indication of the level of performance you can expect from that active ingredient. So the longer the line, the more efficacy it's likely to give you. And you remember what I said earlier, the longer the line, the more efficacy you get, the more likely that active ingredient is to break for that mode of action as you select more powerfully. So every time we're putting a fungicide program together, we're thinking about how can we mix, how can we use different modes of action, how can we use different active ingredients to put together a fungicide program. And what I said earlier about wanting to match is important, because we need to use the active ingredients with the longer bars to achieve the disease control we need, to keep the level of performance up in the crop, to achieve the yields that we need from our winter wheat crops. But equally, we need to make sure we balance things out. And when we think about which of those active ingredients are most effective at protecting other active ingredients, well, actually, the mode of action, the active ingredient that gives you the highest level of control, is the active ingredient that will most effectively protect other active ingredients. So if you take Fulpip, for example, a multi-site, that's often considered a good protective method to control resistance development. And this call is not about knocking Fulpip at all. It's got an important role to play there. But Fulpip will only protect another active ingredient to the level of performance it's able to give. Being a multi-site means it protects itself. A multi-site itself doesn't mean it protects the other active ingredient in the tank beyond the level of performance it gives. Something like Inatrek, for example, with a very high level of performance of Septoria, will actually protect the other ingredients in the tank very effectively, but it does it at the risk to itself, because it's doing the heavy lifting in the disease control. So when you start to put this thinking together, we start to look at Revasol, which is the the best balance in terms of the level of performance it achieves itself and the ability to protect other ingredients and its actual resistance to insensitivity development. Now, no one's ever going to say that Revysol will not develop any resistance, but so far it appears very, very robust. And after 4 years of use, there's been no detected shift in Revysol sensitivity, added to the fact that we know that azoles are very robust and they stay very static in their performance over the 50 years. And added to the fact as well that with Revysol, we have got a molecule that is actually able to flex. And you can see how this part of the molecule moves, which means as you get mutations in the Septoria binding site, the Revysol is still able to bind. So we believe Revysol is the most sustainable active ingredient to use. But we do believe it needs to be used in programs with other modes of action as well. We need to be using all the tools that are available to us to achieve sustainable disease control. But we really believe a program that is which is not using Revysol, not using Revystar somewhere in it, is putting increased weight on other active ingredients and increases the selection pressure that they are exerting on themselves. And of course, azoles have been important for a long time. They will remain to be important for the future. And there is really only 2 azoles that people are primarily using for Septoria control now. We have Revysol and we have prothioconazole, which is often formulated with other active ingredients as a resistance partner. And it is just worth reminding ourselves with the final slide here, actually the difference between Revysol and prothioconazole. This is 10 results from last year. The difference between Revysol and prothioconazole, I think, is well established in the market, but we thought we would do some work last year. In the year Jared and Aoife have just shown you, in the year when the dry May actually reduced the impact of Septoria, yet we were still seeing a yield advantage for Revysol over Proline of nearly 0.9 of a tonne. So the difference between those 2 azoles in terms of their performance is maintained, and if anything, it's growing as we see some further movement to prothioconazole's sensitivity in Septoria, and we maintain the performance of Revysol. So as we bring this time to an end, just to take some comments to take away, really, we've talked a lot about the variability of crops this year, and we need to mitigate the risk of Septoria the best we can. And we need to think about fungicides. We need to think about their resistance risk. We need to think about how useful those fungicides are in protecting the other fungicides in the tank. We need to think about whether they're curative in nature or whether they're protectant in nature. But we also need to think about how they can affect the progression of the epidemic, and actually try and recreate that dry May in terms of slowing the disease progression, even if we get a more mixed weather in May that we need to maximise the yield potential of these crops. All of these factors are really, really important. And we know with Revystar, we've got a product that can be a really useful tool, and the best tool in terms of a lot of these factors, a tool that's really important to build in with the other fungicides that are available, a tool that allows you to maintain your healthy area, to increase the duration of that, and therefore lead to yield. Other factors as well, its broad spectrum ability, its ability to control eye spot with efficacy against eye spot at least as good as we're achieving with prothioconazole, control of yellow rust and control of brown rust as well. Very, very effective product against brown rust. Go and have a look at the AHDB curves from this year, as our trials team are starting to report that brown rust is actually at quite significant levels in certain crops even now. Not suggesting treat yet, but it's definitely a disease to keep going on. So we can maintain that broad spectrum activity without any compromise on our Septoria control. So I'll leave it there with the thought that triazoles do maintain and retain their role as the backbone to our cereal fungicide programs. And with that, Revasol is definitely the strongest partner to protect at-risk mode of actions whilst maintaining the high performance disease control that we need. So Jane, I think back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, Jared and Aoife. And thank you once again for everyone that's been joining us online today. First up, I think let's give Steve a little break as soon as he's just been speaking. And if we can bring back the speakers. Aoife, I've got a couple of questions for you on variable leaf layer emergence. So have we discussed the results on the variable leaf layer emergence with any of the breeders? And do they have any comment or advice on this variability?
We haven't discussed it with the breeders. I think originally why I was interested in this was to look at more from the variety side, actually. And what it proved really interesting, it turned into looking at timings a bit more. But there is relevance there to look at things like latent periods, the questions around, is it actual true resistance or is it more of a disease escape effect? So yes, the follow-on from this, one side of this, will look at the question around tagging in or timing in the leaf layer emergence with when the disease epidemic came in, and then how fast that disease epidemic progressed, especially when you have 2 seasons and 4 sites. There's something very interesting to be tagged on there. But that's a follow-on from this.
Great, thank you. We've got a bit of background noise. I'm not sure what was going on there, so apologies to the viewers for that. And just a follow-up question on that, Aoife. Do you envisage a time where people will select variety based on that variability of leaf layer emergence, where that will kind of be a bit more of a key consideration for variety selection?
It already is happening. So at the moment, people are looking for varieties that perhaps have slower development or faster development, but I think they're selecting them for that situation early in the season. So what we didn't expect perhaps was that would translate into the actual leaf layer emergence in the field. And I'm not sure how easy that will be to predict year on year, but through these trials that we're really grateful that BASF funded, we can maybe start to build a bigger picture around this, around what's actually happening, not early in the season, but also throughout the season as well. And is there a question or something that can be gathered for these varieties that develop faster in the season? Do they have a shorter periods of when their leaves emerge, and then your slower developing varieties have a longer period? And we still haven't got a full answer to that question, but I think it's something that we can definitely gather more information of across the seasons.
Great, thank you. I think if everyone can just, the speakers, if you can go on mute while you're not speaking, because I'm not sure who was giving the feedback, but yeah, we just to avoid our viewers' ears. We've had lots of more questions come through, so many thanks for those. I think just going to Jared, just thinking back to the ADAS work that you showed us, would you expect more sprays looking at this work with September drilled crops or earlier tea timings using more robust treatments with the mild winters that are becoming more common now?
I wouldn't necessarily expect more sprays. The sprays are there to hit specific timing, specific leaf layers. Obviously, what it does is gives more variability. I think is going back to Aoife's data and work, it gives more variability. So it's making sure that those timings are targeted correctly, and that might mean a little bit of shift, not a blanket T1 timing for the same varieties, it might mean a little bit of movement within that or within the variety you have on the farm, but I wouldn't necessarily say it would lead to more spray timings. It's just making sure that those timings are more targeted.
A question for Steve, because I like to share the love here. So a couple of questions on the bars that you showed us. The first one being, what size and colour bar would you put the new active Iblon at within those bars? And then perhaps a related question, well, other than triazoles, how long is the usual useful life of a new AI once launched, given the poor performance of multi-sites? So just to ponder on.
Okay, well, how long would the colour of Iblon be? I would say use your look at the AHDB curves, and you can make your own decision on that. Iblon is an interesting new active ingredient from the SDHI class. Bayer obviously have launched that. They will talk to you about the level of performance that will give you. All I would say is the longer you consider that bar would be, the more towards the red end it would be. The shorter you consider it is, the more to the green it would be. So I would say speak to Bayer about the level of performance compared to the other SDHIs. That's not our active ingredient to really talk about its level of performance. The even harder question, I guess, is what is the level of longevity you'd expect from a new active ingredient? And the answer to that is it just depends on the active ingredient. So Revysol, we believe, will have an extremely long life because it has that ability to excuse me, that ability to adapt to mutations and that ability to control strains that have developed to reduce sensitivity to Septoria even after nearly 50 years of use of that mode of action. So in that case, we expect it to last a long time, decades even. Other modes of action, then, if you're aware that a single mutation can actually lead to the performance of that active ingredient dropping off, then the life could be relatively short. But of course, we're only talking about one disease here with Septoria. And if you take something like F500 Comet, where development of resistance to Septoria came very, very quickly after only a relatively few years of use, but we're still getting very, very good control of rust with it. And arguably, it's the best active ingredient available for control of net blotch still in barley. So I guess different modes of action can change to different diseases, but it's unlikely we're going to lose the performance of all diseases to a mode of action. So it just depends.
Thanks, Steve. I'm very conscious that we are coming to the close of our webinar here. I don't want to keep you, but perhaps just a final question for Aoife, just that's come through. Are having blended varieties in the ground any benefit to Septoria control in this variable year?
Yeah, I would say yes. I think any form of diversity that you introduce into your disease control program, whether that's diversity in modes of action, diversity of varieties across a farm or across a field, will do you good. That's what we want to see, is diversity in all its forms. If you choose to blend varieties, great. One way is that will help. It'll help you slow down the epidemic. So in a bad Septoria year, obviously there's multiple other diseases out there as well, but if we just talk about Septoria, you could get up to 6 to 8 cycles of Septoria in a season. And growing a blend or growing multiple varieties across the farm in some way could reduce the number of cycles that you get by 1 or 2, which again reduces the ability of the disease to develop virulence or fungicide resistance. So yeah, definitely diversity in all its forms is a good thing. And yeah, we know from the work we've done on blends or on kind of varietal diversification across the farm that it influences things like yellow rust and brown rust as well. So all you're trying to do is slow down that epidemic in some way. and reduce the number of cycles of the disease that you're getting on farm. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Oh, we have come to a close really here, so I don't want to keep people, but as this question was named, I feel I need to ask you here, also for you, Aoife, with this season in mind, have you done any work on very late drilled winter wheats, e.g. Skyfall or Palladium, drilled in Feb? You could just give a very quick answer on that.
Yeah. So we did have someone came to me yesterday about this, and I would say that for Skyfall, you're probably going to be asking for trouble on that if you drill it very late, largely due to the yellow rust pressure. So we know that the later you drill something like Skyfall, the more yellow rust that you get. Later drilled crops get worse yellow rust. So Skyfall, you could be asking for trouble. Palladium has a different disease spectrum, so it's a little bit less risky, but if you're going to drill Skyfall in February, be prepared to be catching yellow rust all season. That's all I would say. I'm about to close.
Lovely. Okay, I think we best draw it to a close. We're a couple of minutes over here. Like I say, please email me if you'd like me to pass on any questions to our speakers today. So jane.kitchen@basf.com. The webinar will be available on our website in the next day or two to watch on catch up. So again, if you have further questions, please feel free to get in touch. And yeah, all that's left to say is just again a huge thank you to our speakers and for everyone that's joined us this morning. I know, yeah, it's always a busy time, so it's really much appreciated. So with that, we will let you go. Thank you very much.